It's the Friday Cocktail, presented by Anna Glowinski.
Right now, I am joined on the line by a Sri Lankan Welshie. It's quite an unusual mix. And he's going to be talking about his book, Return to Sri Lanka. And he's going to describe to us the life and the politics and culture of the beautiful and complex island. So really great to have you here. How are you doing, Razeen?
I'm well, thank you. And in Sri Lanka. So
you're in the place itself. What time is it there?
It's let's see, it's almost 9 o'clock at night.
Okay.
In Sri Lanka. Yeah.
Okay, so it's dark. Is it dark already?
Yes, it's dark. I left cold and wet Wales and England just under a week ago, so it's nice to be somewhere warm.
What is the weather like at this time of year?
This time of year, it's the cooler time of the year. So it's not as humid as it can be later on in the year, but it's still nice and sunny during the day, and there are cool breezes. Colombo is on the Indian Ocean, so there are nice breezes that come off the sea. So it's a nice time of year to be in the country.
Well, you're going to be telling us all about the country, so much about it, from tourist places to visit to its history, its culture. But let's get to know you a little bit first, because that is a very unusual mix. I must say, I think you're probably the first Sri Lankan Welsh that I've ever met. Have you met many others?
Only two, my younger brothers.
That doesn't count.
Yeah. Well, it's if you'd like to hear the story of how it came about.
Absolutely.
My mother she was born and brought up in Rhyl, North Wales.
Mm-hmm.
And when she was just under 18, she emigrated to Australia. And on the ship, she met a Sri Lankan young man, only a little bit older than she was, who had done his Air Force training with the Royal Ceylon Air Force in Western Supermare. And he was on his way back to Ceylon, as it was then called, with his batchmates. And so they met on the ship. But my mother carried on to Australia, where she lived for 2 years and a bit. She was in New Zealand for a few months, then went back to Wales, but they corresponded. And they met up again when my father was doing another bout of Air Force training in the UK, got engaged. And then my mother went out to Ceylon to get married in 1961. And there she stayed for the next 16 years. My brothers and I were born there, and we were brought up as Sri Lankans, but with a Welsh British heritage as well.
And how do those two cultures mix, especially for a child? The upbringing. Was your upbringing different to that of the kids around you?
No, pretty much. I mean, I was brought up pretty much the same as my Sri Lankan Muslim cousin. So my father's from the Sri Lankan Muslim community, which is also a minority in the country. I mean, 2/3 of Sri Lankans are Buddhists. The Muslims are about 10%, just under, of the population. So I had a conventional Muslim upbringing in Sri Lanka. The difference was that I had a British mother, which of course my cousins didn't have. But it was of course a very different upbringing to the upbringing I would have had I been born in Britain to British parents, not of an Asian heritage. So when I first came over to Britain, when I was about 7 or 8, I think it was a culture shock. It took time to adjust to, of course, a different country, different landscapes, different climate, but also very different cultural surroundings. At school, I had a British grandmother, of course, but it did take a while to adjust to regular British life, given the life I had in Sri Lanka.
Can you give us some examples of those differences or the things that really stood out to you, for better or worse?
Yeah. I mean, I now realize there are some nice British beaches and there's plenty of really interesting British coastline. But when I first caught sight of a British beach, I thought, is that really a beach? Because I'd been used to some of the best tropical beaches in the world. I was used to large spaces, to outdoor swimming pools, to swimming in the sea, and also to having help in the home. But I had to make up my bed for the first time when I was, say, 8 years old, and help my mother with washing dishes and all sorts of things. And of course, get used to new kids at school who were completely different to the kids I was used to in the school I went to in Sri Lanka. Perhaps the biggest difference was that in Sri Lanka, I was used to having a large extended family around me, because I had aunts and uncles and lots of cousins, and we were in and out of each other's houses every day of the week. I went to see my grandmother, who lived in a separate house, every day of the week. And then in the UK, we were just one small family, without lots of relatives. So it felt isolated and a little lonely to begin with. But and we were back and forth in the 70s, 1 year in Sri Lanka, 1 year in Britain. So I ended up changing schools about 13 times, I think.
Wow, that's unusual.
So that took some getting.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about childhood at the moment, because I've actually been to Sri Lanka. I don't remember how many years ago, 10, 15 years ago, and I absolutely loved it. It was really, really amazing. I've not done many holidays outside of Europe, so it really had a big impact on me. And I remember one of the things that I really noticed, and this is just, my own personal observation, but I'd see the kids and the little boys as well, so tactile with each other. They'd be walking down the street like a group of boys all holding hands. You do not see that in Britain. And Talk Radio Europe is a Spanish-based radio station, so there's a difference between England and Spain as well. I see that the Spanish kids are more tactile than the British kids. They'll maybe sling an armour over their shoulder amongst boys and things like that. But in Sri Lanka, it was next level. They would almost be like chatting and stroking each other's hair. It was so intimate. Is that how you see Sri Lanka as well?
And that remains the case today. So young boys, even boys into their, let's say, late teens, or even beyond that, it's quite common and considered quite normal to put your hand around someone else's shoulder. Or sometimes you even see boys, very gingerly holding hands. But that's not considered. They're not considered necessarily gay. And bear in mind, it's a conservative society, like most other Asian societies. Being gay or lesbian is can be difficult for a lot of people, quite unlike most places in the West these days. Yeah. But that thing about boys or even young men, even gently holding hands, is considered a sign of friendship and nothing. But you do see that in some other Asian countries as well. Sri Lankans are generally, and I'm sure you discovered this when you were there, and you must have done a round trip and gone to a few different places in the island. They're gregarious. The Sinhalese, in particular, they're very sociable. They're very warm and welcoming to outsiders. You see flashing smiles with lots of glistening white teeth, and they're very tactile with it. And they'll find any excuse to have a party. Most days of the week.
You know what? Yes. And maybe you can give me a little bit more of the historical context about this party that I'm about to tell you about, because I know that in your book you do go into a lot of the politics and history, and that's something that I don't, and I'm sure lots of the listeners don't know so much about. But just on that note of parties, I ended up getting taken to a party in a jungle. I think it was the Independence Day party.
Yes.
That's what people told me. And it was completely mad. I just got in a tuk-tuk with someone, got driven into the jungle, I didn't know where I was going, and ended up in sort of like this huge, and I'm saying huge, there were hundreds, if not a couple of thousand people in a clearing in the jungle. And everyone was just sort of milling around. And then at some point the music started, and it was literally just like a switch went off, and suddenly everyone was jumping, dancing, like moving so much. But what I also noticed is that it was mostly lads. I was one of the very, very few girls at that party.
Yeah. That's, I mean, among young people these days, there are a lot of parties that are mixed, and you'll find mixed dancing, for example. I mean, was the dancing Western style, or was it local music?
Do you know, I can't really remember. I think it was quite local music, but it was definitely youthful, and it was definitely energetic. It was kind of, you know, jumping and... Yeah.
Yes. There's a form of local music called baila, which came from the Portuguese originally.
Okay.
It has a very specific beat. The dancing is very gyrating. There are lots of sudden twisting movements.
Okay.
And that's something you find boys and girls, men and women doing. But what you said about this being mainly a male hangout doesn't surprise me either.
Okay.
There are some party-like settings which are gender segregated, especially when it comes to sports. The sports in Sri Lanka are still very male-dominated, and of course, cricket dominates everything in Sri Lanka. I mean, as is the case in India and other countries in South Asia, cricket is the one unifying religion in the country, and it really is a religion. Almost everybody lives and breathes cricket, even women these days, and we do have women's cricket in Sri Lanka now, which wasn't the case going back, let's say, a generation and a bit. But it's still very much male-dominated, and the socializing that goes on around cricket is still very much a male affair. So, for example, some of the major sports fixtures in the country are cricket matches, annual cricket matches between pairs of schools. And the really big one is between the two major private schools in Colombo, Royal College and St. Thomas's College, which takes place around April. And it's a 3-day affair which captures the national imagination. And old boys, and these are both boys' schools, of course,
okay.
They have a 3-day non-stop party which revolves around the cricket match.
I wonder if I ended up in a cricket ground or something, actually, because it was that sort of size. It could well be. But I must admit, I felt very safe and I felt very welcome, and it was really, really fun. But what I'd like to go into now is, I think, and I might be wrong, but I think I remember that it was an Independence Day celebration. Could you go into a little bit more about the background and the context of that, and the political and the civil war history of, you know, the last recent decades of Sri Lanka?
Sure. Well, Independence Day is on February the 4th, so it's coming up in just a few weeks. And Ceylon, as it then was, got independence from the British on February the 4th, 1948. Barely 6 months after India and Pakistan became independent of British rule. Now, before that, the British had ruled the island for about a century and a half. Before that, there was a century and a half of Dutch rule, and before that, a century and a half of Portuguese rule. So you had almost 500 years of Western colonial rule of Sri Lanka, which is important to bear in mind because no other country in Asia was ruled for as long by Western powers. So there was a huge amount of Western influence in Sri Lanka. And it wasn't just the British, it was an overlay of the Dutch and the Portuguese as well, that flowed into independent Ceylon post-1948. then what happened was that, I mean, we have, as you saw when you came here, a fascinating multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious mix. For me, it's one of the glories and the wonders of Sri Lanka, the fact that it is so culturally hybrid.
Yeah.
But it can also be combustible. So especially after independence, the Sinhalese Buddhist majority, so the ethnic Sinhalese, who are overwhelmingly Buddhist, acquired political control of the country. And then followed problems between the Sinhalese and the minorities. So the main minority is the Tamil population, who are mainly Hindus. And then there are Muslims. And then there are Christians, some of them Sinhalese, some of them Tamils. So as I said, this can be quite combustible. And ethnic problems, religious problems between the Sinhalese Buddhist majority on the one side and the Tamil minority on the other side became more acute. And that blew up in a civil war that started in 1983 and continued for 25 years until it ended in 2009 with a victory, for a military victory for the government in Colombo, which is Sinhala Buddhist dominated. And that was the end of a Tamil secessionist movement in the north and the east of the country, which campaigned for independence from the 1970s until the war ended. So that was a very bloody period in Sri Lankan history. We've had 16 years of peace since the end of the war, and there was a boom in tourism until COVID hit, and there was an economic crisis straight after that. Tourism is back with a vengeance now. It's a very good season at the moment. I mean, to put it in a nutshell, here's a country of 20 million people in an island of the size of Ireland, not bigger than that. And you would think, well, it can't be that complicated. Small country, small island, small population. But once you're here for a day or two and you get to meet locals and you learn more about the history and current affairs, you realize what a complicated country it is, with layers upon layers of complication, and how eventful it is always. There's never a dull moment in Sri Lanka, whether it's a case of getting to know individuals, because the country is full of colorful characters, or whether it's a case of daily politics and current affairs. In fact, there are too many exciting moments in the country, and that continues. So that's just to give you a flavor of Sri Lanka's excitements and complications. And the subtitle of my book is "Travels in a Paradoxical Island," because almost everything you come across is a paradox. There are lots of contradictions. We've talked about how friendly Sri Lankans are, which you experienced. The other side of the coin is that there's a record of a lot of violence in Sri Lanka, of Sri Lankans against Sri Lankans. There are dark sides to the island as well. And it's all very difficult to unravel and to make sense of.
And what did that sort of look like, that civil war, for day-to-day life? Because obviously in the island you have got some cities and smaller towns, you've got beaches, and then you've got jungle areas and more uninhabited areas. People had to go about their daily life as well, because it lasted for a long time. You're saying 25 years. What did that look like in different areas? Was it very localized? How did it play out?
It was very contradictory, and it meant very different things for different people. The fighting was concentrated in the main Tamil areas, which are in the north and the east of the island. The Tamil culture in those parts of the country, particularly in the north, is quite different. The landscape is very different. A lot of it is scrub jungle. The towns are small. It's more thinly populated than the Sinhalese parts of the country. So that's where people felt it most. And as I traveled through these parts of the country in the years soon after the war ended, I saw the scars. In the urban areas and even more so in the rural areas. But in other parts of the country, starting with Colombo, the capital, most people, most of the time, got on with their lives in a bubble, seemingly far away from all the blood and gore of the fighting. Yes, they were affected because the odd bomb went off here or there. That happened in Colombo on many occasions. People were scared for their children because they always feared, well, maybe a bomb might go off in front of their school as they went in or as they went out, or at a bus stand, or in an office block. And that did happen. But especially people who were better off were largely insulated from fighting during that period, and they had options. They could send their children to schools in the UK or in Australia, or maybe they had second homes in these or other countries. But of course, that was not the case for the majority. The rich mostly didn't send their kids to fight Tamil tigers in the north and the east. Their kids were safely away abroad or in Colombo. It was the poor whose kids went to fight because those jobs were very well paid in a country where there was and remains a shortage of productive employment. And if, say, a son was seriously injured or maimed or even killed, well, his parents got a decent pension. Even in the Sinhalese areas, which were spared the brunt of the fighting, it was the poor who felt it more, because it was their kids who were doing the fighting, who were cannon fodder, effectively. They weren't officers, they weren't generals. They were those who actually saw combat and had to sacrifice most. So it's a quarter century of Sri Lanka's history with a lot of different stories in different areas. As I traveled through the north and the east and came across people who suffered most, those were the stories that were really scarring, because you saw how traumatized mothers were or widows were, and how that left a stain for the rest of their lives. And you realize then that the scars of war were a generational thing, not scars that would heal within a few years, but at best within a generation or two.
Yeah, war does
and
that.
Those scars still remain.
It does. War definitely does that. Look, we haven't got too much longer to go, and I want to ask you so many more things, but I'm just keeping my eye on the clock here. We've touched on your personal history. We've gone into a bit of the war and the complicated political history of Sri Lanka, and also briefly touched on sort of the beauty and the tourism. That's a lot to pack in. What was it that inspired you to write this book, and why did you want to encompass so many different elements rather than honing down on one thing?
Well, I started writing this book when I was in my mid-40s, which is when I started to go back to Sri Lanka regularly after a long period, about 30 years, when I was away much of the time, and also the country was very distant for me mentally. So I wanted to get to know my own country better than I knew it as a child. And I realized the best way of doing that was to write a book about it, because then I would be on duty, as it were. I would really have to pay attention. Now, I didn't want to write an academic book about Sri Lanka because I was an academic. I had written academic books.
Right.
I didn't want to do more of that kind of writing. I was always a fan of travel writing from my 20s. I always wanted to write a travel book like Bruce Chatwin or V.S. Naipaul or Patrick Levermore or others. And Sri Lanka was the obvious place to start because I had that personal connection. So I decided I would write a travel book about Sri Lanka, and I would use my own story to try and tell a broader story about the country. But even more so, I would travel around the country as much as I could and use those journeys to tell that bigger story about Sri Lanka that would pack in as much as possible, history, culture, religion, people, landscapes, all the way to current affairs of the Civil War, what happened before and what happened afterwards. So that's what I tried to pack into one book, and that was very challenging. It took some time.
And that was the outcome as well. There's so much more that I really want to pick your brains about, because there's so much that's gone into this. And I'm like, have I picked out all the best parts? I don't know. But we don't have time. But I guess that's what the book's there for, isn't it? If anybody else
absolutely.
has those questions that I've got, they can get their hands on the book. And it's called Return to Sri Lanka. It's by Razeen Sally. You can find it on the Talk Radio Europe bookshop, or I suppose just pop it into Google and it'll come up with where you can purchase this book. Razeen, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. Lovely to talk to you, Anna.
Lovely to talk to you, and good night over there at 9 p.m. in Sri Lanka.
And good afternoon to you.
Bye-bye.